All right. Hello, I'm Bree, and this is my presentation on social interaction and second language acquisition. So, what kind of inspired this topic is a lot of what we studied in class about universal grammar and some of what I read in introducing second language acquisition. Basically, it talked about how people are kind of born with, or children are born with, this innate ability to understand any language and understand grammar. And really, it's just the adults being there and present with them that they're learning like what sounds, apply and what sounds like don't matter, and or what sounds have meaning. And then, they get that language of whatever their parents are saying. But in introducing second language acquisition, it talks about how like all infants are making sounds like their parents don't even teach them. I just thought that was like so fascinating, because to me it just kind of showed that social interaction ends up being like a really determining factor for like what language someone speaks, is like who's around them, who's interacting with them. And but they're born with the capability of like already making any sound for any language in hearing those sounds. So I just thought that was really interesting. So that kind of affirmed in me, like, okay, like I want to do social interaction. Like it's important. And then also reading about Vygotsky and just how he kind of concluded that social interaction was like the reason people, like how people acquire language, and just how scaffolding happens naturally in conversations and in interactions, which I really do feel like I see that, like the context of what we're doing and, where we're at, and when we're talking, like plays a huge role in communication. I see that as scaffolding. And then these two documentaries like played probably the biggest role in it for me. Like children left alone without any social interaction don't acquire language, like in the case of Jeannie Wiley. Once she had people in her life, she started making strides. There's obviously a lot to consider there because it's such a heartbreaking story, but that kind of showed to me like, yeah, we're born with this ability, natural ability as babies to acquire language, but if you don't have someone there, you still don't get language. And then in this next study, the Birth of a Language documentary, children without language, but if they have each other, but still either of them don't have a language, they can create language, which I thought was incredible. Um, so again, I just see like social interaction being this really important factor in it for language. So this led to my questions and hypothesis. So as I've made it pretty clear, social interaction with native speakers, I think, is like the most important part of learning language. But I'm wondering what kind of social interaction is most helpful for students acquiring a second language. So I'm thinking of like teachers and stuff, like what's actually the most helpful way to do that, because it's obviously very important. My hypothesis is that direct conversation increases language acquisition more than engaging activities, because language use is more in directing activities. And I just think it's easy to like not have to use language as much in activities because you're doing things. So I just figured you're going to be practicing and using more, of the language in a direct conversation. So wouldn't that help more? So to test this, I planned on kind of planning activities, planning conversation times, and just comparing the data and contrasting it. But it took me a while to like figure out like how I was going to do this. So the first, it'll explain in later PowerPoint, but so I got my case study student, 19-year-old male, AOAP. He's from Japan. His family really only spoke Japanese. He has taken like a total of 7 years in English and 1 year in Indonesian. He took the TOEIC test that everyone has to take to get into AUAP, and he was not happy with his score. He saw himself as a very low-level speaker. I gave him a B1 on the European framework. He gave himself like on the scale of 1 to 10, like a 4. He was not impressed with himself, but I was really impressed with him. I tried to make that clear. He said the best way to help him learn English is just by talking in conversation. He was really excited about being able to talk every week with a native speaker. He made it pretty clear. This is his first time in the US and an English-speaking country, first time learning English abroad. So he was just really excited to learn. 70% of his day, though, he speaks Japanese, and 30% of his day he speaks English, which I thought was really interesting. So he's using a lot of Japanese in his day. So week 1, 2, and 3. So these first 3 weeks, I was really developing kind of just my questions, hypothesis, how I was going to test this. So it's definitely not as clear-cut as week 4. You're going to see like activities and then direct conversation times and like me comparing it. But week 1, 2, and 3, I was mainly just kind of learning about who he was and figuring out his level and all of that. I realized it was pretty amazing how much we could communicate, even though he said there was a lot of vocabulary, grammar, and syntax that he didn't know. Like I'd be using something, he was like, I don't know that word, but he would be able to respond and kind of assume where I was going because of like what was like the context of the question, or like what things what I was talking about before, or just all of that. It was kind of, we had some good conversation about that. Examples, gestures, and demonstrations went a long way for him. He needed a lot of that, especially at the beginning. He was like really unfamiliar with hearing a native speaker. So my language was super modified. I removed like articles sometimes and repeated phrases, simplifying language to like the root structure, like subject, verb, object. When he didn't understand a sentence, I would like break it down more and more, pausing, slowing down, obviously removing slang and idioms. He wanted to talk with native speakers as much as possible. He pronounced slang slong, and I taught him chilling with my homies and chilling with my peeps. And he was excited about that. He asked me, this was his first question he asked me. When I said chilling with my peeps, he was like, what's peeps? And before I could respond to him, he kind of looked at me and was like, people? And I thought that was so fascinating because he just kind of on his own because he knew what people meant. And he knew I was talking about being with friends. I was like chilling with my peeps. He just kind of figured out, oh, peeps must mean people, like on his own. And that to me was like a really good example of like kind of, I don't know, like scaffolding, like he kind of used like the knowledge he knew about people and the context of that to kind of figure out that like peeps and people mean the same thing. But yeah, he just did that on his own. Week 4 is when I actually started doing like activity versus direct conversation times. Basically, I decided, okay, I'll do a pool game and we'll have like Spotify music and we'll do this and we'll like talk and I'll like keep track of his language use. And then we'll have a direct conversation time where he's like answering questions and we're like talking about these deeper topics and see like which is more productive. So the new vocabulary that he learned for the pool during the pool match was pool, scratch, pool hustler, style, and solid. Pronounced solid, salud. And he asked some pretty complex questions. He was like, what kind of music do you like? I was pretty impressed with that. In direct conversation, he was talking a lot more, and he learned the word social interaction. But he didn't use it like he was in pool. Like in pool, he was like using these words like over and over again as he was playing. He was not doing that in the conversation times. I noticed that he pronounces V's and B's. He gets those mixed up a lot. And so what I noticed was in the activity, we can do a lot of communication through actions. I think the actions paired with the new vocabulary acted as social scaffolding, and vocabulary paired with movement, according to like one of the articles I was reading, it really aids in language acquisition, being able to move. Just like for children, when they say mama and mama moves toward them, they're kind of learning like what these words mean. And just movement is like really important when you're learning. So new vocabulary was like basically the gain for the activity, and practice of complex language use and like understanding was a gain for the conversation, is what I noticed on this first week. Week 5. So I did pool again, but I switched the order. I did pool after the direct conversation. For the direct conversation, he learned least in foreign language classroom. He pronounced English ingles, did the V and B kind of mixing up again, and he used O and at the end of words a lot. I think it might be similar to us going is what I'm thinking, but I don't know. I just used it. Modals. He used modals and gerunds and subordinators, so he was using a lot of just pretty complex things, I thought, during the conversation time, but he forgot what social interaction meant from our last conversation time when I explained it to him. He didn't remember. I had to re-explain it to him again. And then for the pool game in Spotify, he remembered pool. Like, he was like, oh, pool, and he told me stories about when he played pool, and that was a new word, like, the first time. So he remembered that word, and he even remembered style. He was like, style, when I said it, kind of wondering, and then he's like, type, it means type. I was like, yeah. So he remembered that. Even as he was like aiming like to hit a ball, he was like thinking, he's like, yeah, it means type, I remember. So that was cool. He definitely remembered vocab words from the activity time, but not from the conversation time. And he asked another complex question: why do you want to learn Korean? And he did it perfectly. He never asked questions in the direct conversation time. If he asked questions, it's about grammar and syntax usually, but in the activity, he was more social questions, I was noticing. So he forgot almost all the vocabulary in general. Definitely forgot all in the conversation times, remembered some from the activity. I think he remembered pool because it was paired with the action, and I just think that helps us remember. And I also learned something from another article I was reading about, that music aids language acquisition. So I was kind of like, oh, I was playing music during pool, so I should probably try to like not do music to see if like it's actually the activity or if music was helping. So that's something to think about for my next activities. Basically, conversation times though are the only times he's telling me big stories. I noticed he's not doing big stories during the activity. So week 6, for this one, I alternated between activity and direct conversation. So some of the activities I did was origami and cards. He learned fold, stack, crane, and cards. And he used fold over and over again to teach me how to do origami. And he said crane over and over again. And when he taught me a Japanese game, he used stack for stacking cards. And those were all new words for him, and he was using them a lot. And this was his first slang use during this activity too. He said, what do you want to make? And he was asking me, how do you say this? How do you say that? Again, just he's actually asking like questions in the activity times a lot more than the conversation. And in the conversation time, I got to teach him adapt, but he was not certain about it because I had to just use examples and modify my language, but he was kind of looking at me uncertain. He did get to share some cross-cultural experiences. He got to share a big story here about the differences in Japan from the US, which was good. He wasn't talking as much as like a story like this in the activity time. So he was definitely practicing and just making small errors like leaving out articles and stuff. So I avoided music because I learned that does help language acquisition. But I did notice he still was learning and using a lot of vocabulary. So maybe music didn't have that big effect on the pool instance. Kinesthetic learning was something I was kind of interested in as I was reading. I really see this at play with my case study student. Just he sees the action and he applies it like repeatedly. And it's just, I think that's the number one reason why these words are sticking. Adapt. Explanations just don't go as far, I'm noticing, as the action, which makes sense. Direct conversation times are really the only times he's really practicing and pushing himself, like that harder grammar. The activities just don't require as much effort in these areas because you can communicate a lot through action. So he's not having to pull as much on pull as much weight, I guess. So week 7, new vocabulary that he learned, incidentally, an aha moment. So I actually taught these to him by example in using modified language. He did not understand when I tried to explain to him the first time, but the second time I gave him an example in Spanish, how I see Spanish around me. And so I didn't need to go to a classroom to learn. I just saw it. And he was like, oh, like aha moment, incidental. Like he actually used those words to explain his stories. Like I learned incidentally, when I came to America, and I was like, oh, wow, like he's using these words now. And he talked about how like he knew what yummy meant because his IPA got food and said yummy, yummy, yummy. And he knew it meant delicious. And then his friend said adios. And he was like, oh, it means bye. And so I was like, wow, okay, this is really good examples. And I said, what's an aha moment in class? And he said, his teacher says, gotcha, after he understands his question. So it means I understand is what he said. He was exhausted after this conversation time. It was really hard for him. Like he was super confused. And I had to work really hard and a long time with him to help him understand everything. So I think that exhaustion may have had a factor for the activity time because he did not want to talk. He was just yawning the whole time and like wanted to go home. So Ligretto was not successful, that card game. It didn't go well. So this conversation was the densest and hardest for him to understand by far. He used a lot of Japanese during Ligretto. So he did learn incidentally an aha moment. He used them, and when I asked them in questions after my example, he was like answering correctly. I really saw like, Krashen's theory about comprehensible input like at play, like with giving examples that kind of gave him enough CI, or like the actions paired with the word, like giving him CI. It seemed really important for him to have that, obviously, to be able to talk about it. Something new that I learned from this is that context played a huge role in him acquiring new vocabulary, like based on his examples with his IPA and his teacher, like the context of when they spoke that word was like really important. And so that's something now that I'm really thinking about and wish I had observed more. It was cool to hear him say those stories. So week 8, so I did a direct conversation time and I did art after. I modified my language quite a bit for this one. It was interesting here. He caught his own mistake. He was talking about, is it important to make, is it important or not important to be correct? And he said a sentence here. He said, I make mistakes. I can get many things about English. And he looked at me like, oh, that doesn't make sense. And then he said, if I make mistakes in English, I can notice my mistakes so I can fix my grammar. And I was like, oh yeah, you just did it. That was pretty cool. Here he was really saying like he's embarrassed to make mistakes in class, but not in front of a native speaker. I think the classroom setting has a lot of pressure for him. He made it pretty clear. He's like, yeah, AAP, like I don't like talking because I have the pressure. So I really see the affective filter at work here in context again. Now I'm really thinking about that. Calligraphy and painting, he was so excited about this. He just loved it. He learned so many new words: calligraphy, paintbrush, canvas, introvert, extrovert. He was asking questions. He was using a ton of slang, gonna and wanna. This day was the most slang I've heard him use as far as just, kind of linking words together. He was doing a lot of that. He was sharing about Tokyo as he painted it. He's like, look, see the mountain? And he was doing conversational cues. When I would talk, he'd go, oh, really? And that was new. And saying oops when he dropped things. Yeah, this was like really good. I was like, wow, like, I don't know what's going on with this art stuff, but he's like really learning a lot. And yeah, it was like great. So this was the best conversation time in any activity by far. Like the art time, when he created, he wanted to talk about what he created. I read an article about it, and it was talking about how art lowers the affective filter because people can express themselves, feel comforted and safe. They want to talk about, what they did, what they created. And it's just easier to understand things visually rather than verbally for learners, which makes total sense. He used a lot of slang too. I thought was really interesting. He seemed just a lot more comfortable. So yeah, he's definitely learned to use more vocabulary in the art activities, but still practicing more syntax and grammar in the direct conversational times. Activities are prompting him to ask social questions. Direct conversation is usually questions about English, like I've mentioned before. So for my conclusion, direct conversation times require more grammar and syntax and practice from students. They're just it's more challenging for students that are doing a lot more in direct conversation times, and they just don't have those visual cues as much. However, most of his vocabulary did come from the activities. I think pairing motion or visuals with the word just goes farther. And they just get to apply it right away, and he enjoyed it. He was having so much fun with the activities. So to further study, I'd recommend observing a native speaker with a language learner during both activity and conversation. I think that would kind of eliminate, like, I could kind of steer things the way I wanted to. I think it'd be better to like be on the outside of that and like observe. Basically less structured conversation times, just be more realistic, making sure you have a variety of activities because everyone's going to be interested in different things. I think it'd be important to compare the questions he asks in the activity times versus conversational time. I didn't have as much time as I would like to have kind of compared those and like take more notes on it, but I think that would be really good to see, like, because he was definitely asking social questions in activity times and more like grammar questions in conversational times. And definitely keeping track of vocabulary I think would be important too. And something new that I did learn from this is study the context. Affective filter played a huge role. Like the classroom, he was pretty clear that he didn't like speaking in the classroom. In like context, like with his IPA saying yummy yummy in a restaurant, like instantly knowing what yummy meant, and he could use it whenever he wanted to easily. So context is really important. So that might be an interesting direction to go with this. So yeah, that's basically my whole thing there, and this is my bibliography. So thank you for watching.